Welcome to the book conversation series that's part of the United States and the World Workshop at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. My name is Osamah Khalil. I'm a professor in the history department at Syracuse and the host of the workshop series. My guest today is Christopher W. Shaw. Dr. Shaw is the author of Money, Power, and the People, The American Struggle to Make Banking Democratic, and he's also the author of Preserving the People's Post Office. Dr. Shaw, welcome.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I'm going to hold up a copy of your book here, which is published by University of Chicago Press. And I thought we could begin this conversation because this was based on your dissertation. And so one of the things I hope is that these book conversations will help both graduate students as they're thinking about their projects or developing them into as they're writing the dissertation or researching the dissertation, then developing them into books, is that this will help them a little bit into kind of working through that process and learning from authors who've done it. So I'm curious, how did this develop into an actual dissertation? Where did you get the idea from and the inspiration, and what kind of initial research did you do to make it, to decide that this was actually a viable project?
Yeah, so I thought that banks seemed very important in American history and just in general, but I wasn't, so I was looking into the issue and I wasn't finding a ton of material that I found to be particularly revelatory or explanatory. And particularly the early 20th century being a pivotal moment, because you have the creation of the Federal Reserve System, you have the establishment of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, all these things. And so this absence in the literature seemed to be there. And then I also was aware that there was, what was really absent in literature was the idea that you had any public involvement in creating these policies at all. And I knew through personal connections that there were people who had been, alive at those times who were interested in these issues. And also, in the American History textbook, you have 1896, William Jennings Bryan's campaign, right, where it's against the Cross of Gold, and then all of a sudden it all disappears. So it hadn't all disappeared, and I was looking at sources and seeing it hadn't all disappeared. And so that led me to delve into the question more deeply. And I was doing a research paper and a seminar with John Giardi at the time, who's a social historian who specialized in immigration. And he was very interested in this subject. So I felt like that was a good sign when you have a social historian where this is not his field and he's interested in this political economy topic. And, he saw the significance of it, and he also liked the social history connection as well, where you're interested in ordinary people. So that was how I got started, was in that seminar paper in the class, and it just kind of unfolded from there. And I was lucky I had a couple other people on the faculty at University of California, Berkeley, who were interested as well. Robin Einhorn, who, she does political economy, so it was sort of more obvious for her. And then also Jan de Vries, the economic historian. But again, he studies early modern Europe, and particularly, the Dutch economy. So the fact that there was this diverse group of people who were interested in it, it kind of encouraged me to push forward with the project. And in the end, ended up with, eventually became this book. So, yeah.
So one of the keys you always hear, and I think it's so important, especially with social history and economic history, as most graduate students and beyond know, the role of archives for historians. And so one of the things that struck me was when I was reading the book was the different kind of primary sources you used. And I was curious about tracking down archives, what challenges you ran into, which ones you used, what challenges you ran into, and how many other people had kind of been through them. That's always often an interesting thing, is when you can get to an archive. It's one thing to find an archive that nobody's used. It's also to find one that other people have used, but they're looking for different things, or they're not interested in the same question. So,
yeah, I mean, to do the research for this project, because it's on a national level and you're trying to see the grassroots, but then at the same time, you also want to see the top-down story too, where you have the bankers and you have leading government officials and politicians. I had to cast the net pretty wide. And so this meant that I actually went to somewhere around like 40 archives in 20 different states. So this was quite a project. The biggest challenge I found, frankly, was just financing this as a graduate student. And I was fortunate to have friends and family in a lot of different places I could stay with, lend me a car, even, lend me a tent. But so, it was a lot of research to put this together. And what I would say in terms of who had looked at these archives before, basically they definitely had not been looking at it with the eyes on the questions that I was interested in. So in that, that was definitely something new. And then, some of these archives, more remote ones, definitely had been visited less frequently. So, Library of Congress, that's one thing, right? But if you're going to, an archive in the Great Plains, they're going to see a lot less traffic. So I definitely got to see a wide range of the archives that are available in the United States.
Well, it's a remarkable number, and you're to be commended for that. I mean, it's really impressive as you go through the book and seeing everything that you've done and how you're able to weave it together. It's very impressive, and I think it should be at a minimum inspiring for other graduate students to really kind of aim high for a project. So I think it's something to be very proud of. So we've talked about it as a dissertation, and so what kind of process did you go through? Because this is always another challenge, right? So there's so much when you're a grad student that focus on getting it, what's the project, and then getting to a dissertation. And then, so you have this dissertation. How did you turn to a book? What was some of the ideas, and how did you reconceptualize it as a book? And what were some of the paths, in the sense that you decided not to take, or obstacles that you had to overcome in terms of reconceptualizing it?
I think the main thing was just the kind of the sheer volume of the material, to try to keep winnowing it down to get a clearer narrative throughout, and to make the more focused story for readers. So that was kind of a constant challenge. And so, how should I narrate this portion? What needs to be left out, right? Is there then going back, okay, well, I guess maybe I took out too much, I need to put this back in. So, I mean, that was really the challenge in terms of making it a book that would be of, interest and accessible to a broader audience than what is your dissertation committee, because that's who you're writing your dissertation for. So that was really the primary challenge in terms of turning it into a book.
That's a great point, and I think that's often what's I think students miss, is how much the dissertation is geared at a very small audience, and then when you step back and think about the book, how you try and find that balance between, okay, I'm no longer trying to appeal to that audience, now it's a much broader audience that we have to try and reach, and developing a narrative that's really clean and accessible. And I think that can be a real, another leap that you have to take as an author, that especially with a project so rich in detail and so expansive in terms of not just the time frame, but the different elements and different agents that you're dealing with. So, and it's a remarkable book, I think. So, so congratulations. So why don't we dig into the book a bit, right? And I think one of the things that really strikes me about your book is that it challenges existing literature on the history of banking, as you've already touched on when you were thinking about and as you were developing that initial research seminar paper. And this history of banking in the U.S. that often emphasizes elite-driven reforms. And your book actually turns it on its head, and it emphasizes popular opposition and advocacy, but it doesn't leave out the elite-driven reforms. But as I think we'll talk about in a little bit, those reforms are often not what we make of them on the elite side. So what was this informal coalition of groups and individuals that pushed for reforms from the bottom up at the turn of the last century?
It's really a coalition between workers who tend to be more urban, and then farmers who obviously are rural. This is the group, and they're united by the fact that they both think there's major issues with the banking system, They have problems with the way money, the currency, and so there's a whole host of reforms that they want, and so it's a very kind of shifting coalition, but it is able to come together at key moments, and also to gain some support from other groups as well, more middle class reformers, figures like that. So you have elements of kind of the remainders of the populist movement and the greenback movement. You have progressives, you have socialists, but I'd say at the core is the union members and members of farmer organizations, where you have workers and farmers who are actually organized politically, and so they're really the ones who are driving this banking politics. That's why I call it this banking politics moving forward.
So what's great, I think, is you have this term that you just referenced, banking politics, and you describe this as this public expression of popular grievance against finance, right? And you talk about in the book that it drew on these 19th century traditions of dissent that were then manifested in the first quarter of the 20th century. So what were some of those traditions, and why was, and you make this point, that banking politics were adversarial. Why were they adversarial?
It definitely does. The legacy of the late 19th century is very important to these reformers in the early 20th century. And you have, also these ideas like the sort of Christian egalitarianism would be seen as sort of a left-wing Christianity these days. You can see the language and the kind of attitudes that people are taking on the issue, drawing on that. And then sort of producerism as well, the idea that it's people who labor who actually create the wealth. So there's these ideas in the background, and then more specifically, the greenbacker reformers who want to totally reshape the way the monetary system works, and then kind of had a legacy to the populists. And the populists are really a lot of issues here. I mean, they want a monetary reform, and we all know about silver, but a lot of them are also interested in greenback dollars, or money that isn't backed by gold, that the government issues it and it has its value because of the government saying it has value. And then they also are interested in things like having savings banks at the post office. They're interested in insurance for existing banks in some cases. So the populists take an interest in a lot of these issues, and then so that's kind of the legacy that we have. And also another one would be anti-monopolism. So concern about monopolies. And then in the 20th century, then you do have sort of progressive reformers and direct democracy, the push for direct democracy for things like the initiative referendum makes people think they should have more say about these reforms too. And then also the socialist movement that's growing. So all of these things are sort of combining together in this banking politics movement.
So there is a fascinating tension that runs through the book, and it's a consistent opposition for any reforms from the banks, and over the course of decades. This isn't just a momentary issue. This is a decades-long issue, as you just touched on. So we have a number of these different traditions coming out of the 19th century into the 20th, and alongside them is this consistent tradition of just blocking and any reform and claiming that these reforms are going to mean the end of American banking, if not the end of Western civilization. You have this just a litany of quotes over and over again, that are almost equivalent of the sky is falling, to the most basic elemental reforms that we take for granted today. And at the same time, this intersection with this grassroots coalition you've described, arguing that these reforms are needed, they're necessary. And so I'm curious, why were the banks so successful in holding off reforms for so long? And why do you think the average consumer had such difficulty in finding allies in government and these grassroots reformers?
It's definitely impressive how they really remain quite unchanging in their resistance for decade after decade. And I mean, I think the issue here is bankers are important people in society, right? And so this means they know members of Congress often personally. They're prominent members of their community. They have a lot of influence, both on the local level and then on the state level and the federal level. You know, they have the money. They have the access, so that's important. And then, you know, the other part of this is they are experts on the issue. And so this gives them a certain prestige and again, helps them to be articulate in these debates. And that was sort of all those things that are working in favor of the bankers. They aren't there for the ordinary citizens. And so this is where you really had to have some creativity and a lot of hard work and a lot of organization on the other side in order to get their point across and actually get these reforms through. Because yeah, the bankers were very unyielding on these issues. I mean, they really valued their independence and their autonomy, and they thought it was outrageous to try to curb that, because the ordinary citizens, they want more government involvement, and the bankers felt that, you know, they knew best and this was their banking system, and they wanted to keep it that way. So it was intense struggle for decades.
And so, of course, you know, coming back to your point about the role of the government and these influential characters on the banking side, and then those who lack influence, the vast mass of people. One of the interesting characters is Senator Carter Glass of Virginia. And so Glass is known as one of as he goes down in history, right, as one of these key reformers. The Glass-Steagall Act, or as it's known, the Banking Act of 1933. And it's often discussed as, you know, the landmark act, if not the landmark act of banking regulation and reform. But your book and you know, what I was so struck by was presents a very different Carter Glass to the public. So who was he, and what role did he play in the story of banking politics?
I was very surprised to learn this myself, especially, you know, I knew about Glass-Steagall before 2008 when I started my research actually before 2008. But then after 2008, the public at large, you know, is hearing all the time about Glass-Steagall. And yeah, his name's on the bill there, but he's not the reformer you might think he was. I mean, he was in the Senate amongst Democrats, he was the most opposed to the New Deal of any of his colleagues. I mean, he voted against, there was a survey of sort of major New Deal legislation, and he voted against the New Deal like over 80% of the time. So this is who he is. And I actually have an article that's forthcoming that really kind of lays out sort of intellectual biography of Carter Glass and his engagement with financial issues. But it's there throughout the book. And, you know, the guy is essentially a reactionary. He carries the water for the bankers. He's always there to sort of defend the bankers and try to promote their interests. But he is living in a time of reform. And he's also someone who does actually like to legislate. So when the situation comes along, he will compromise. But he definitely was trying to hold back the banking politics tide throughout this period and try to help and aid the bankers. And, you know, he had his successes and he had his failures, but he was definitely not the reformer that you would think he was, given the way that, you know, hey, the name of it's Glass-Steagall, but you know, Glass really was not the reformer of the time.
Now, there were reformers, and I think, you know, what I loved about your book is you discuss this range of reformers at all levels, local, state, national. Who were some of the most influential in your view? And one of the things I love is, you know, especially with social history, and is those individuals who are forgotten by history and that you can help bring back to life through your book, and talk about a few of those, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, the just kind of all these really nameless grassroots figures are the ones who are really really pushing this agenda, and, you know, just random people like Irish immigrant carpenter who has an opinion about the fact that he thinks the financial system promotes financial instability and also economic inequality, right? And there's any number of characters like that that never made an appearance before, and now they do in the book. I think also some people who we have heard of, we might see differently after the book. And so one of those would be Jacob Coxy, who, again, he makes a paragraph appearance in the textbook during the 1890s because of the March on Washington. But what's forgotten about him is he was really a financial reformer. In fact, the core of his program was monetary reform. And also, he doesn't just disappear after that. I mean, he's still around into the 1940s, and he has a following all through these decades. So he's an incredibly persistent figure in trying to achieve banking and monetary reform. Another figure comes out of the 1890s, who we all have heard of, and this is William Jennings Bryan, but really his significance to banking and monetary reform in the early 20th century is not often discussed. He's the main proponent behind what will eventually become deposit insurance. Just for instance, it's actually a major campaign plank for him in 1908. We don't really generally think of that, but also just every single financial issue of the time, he's involved with it, and he's sort of consistently on the side of the banking politics people. So he's this major public figure who is an ally, and sometimes they're disappointed in him. For instance, with the Federal Reserve Act, he's brokers the compromise that becomes it, which a lot of people are disappointed at that compromise, but still he's in the middle of all these questions throughout the time. And then I think another one, if we move forward a little bit into the New Deal era, would be the radio priest, Father Coughlin. And the thing is, most of the time when I hear him talked about these days, it's that he's this man who managed to get a mass following through his anti-Semitism, essentially, and his attraction to fascism. But what I found is that, and this actually aligns with what Alan Brinkley found in his book, was that, you don't hear any of this when he actually has a large mass following. So before the 1936 election, when he sponsors a challenge to Roosevelt, and he becomes embittered about that and takes this turn after that. But during the time when he has, millions of listeners, he's not talking about these issues. But one thing that's at the top of his list is, again, banking and monetary reform as a means to get out of the Great Depression. And this becomes important in the Banking Act of 1935 because this is the law that essentially allows the Federal Reserve to start managing the economy. And lo and behold, it's the radio priest who has what was really there was a number of people who had a more sort of radical proposal at the time, but he was probably the most prominent of them. And so this makes the New Deal proposal, with Mariner Eccles came up with, seem very reasonable indeed to the bankers, and kind of, gets them to be more agreeable to it. So the fact that, the radio priest had a central role in the Banking Act of 1935 is just not something that is in the history, but, he definitely had a major role.
And there's another figure that I think, at least and definitely on the West Coast, many will know. And I think this is what's really interesting. So it's not just this cast of characters from the politicians or the reformers, but then on the banking side, you start off with J.P. Morgan's funeral in the book, and then we do get this range of bankers, and one of them is A.P. Giannini and what becomes Bank of America. And what you discuss in the book that I think is really important is the origins of this idea of too big to fail that we see come again and again, but especially after 2008. And yet you trace that idea back all the way to the early part of the 20th century. And so what were those origins, and how did they become so deeply rooted in the history of American banking?
Yeah, A.P. Giannini is definitely right up there in the top in terms of significance to banking in the United States in the 20th century. And the reason he's so important is that he really pushes this idea of branch banks. So there wasn't really much in the way of branch banking in the early 20th century. And A.P. Giannini, through his Bank of Italy that becomes the Bank of America, is really the one who gets the ball rolling here. And this means that his bank is already, by 1933, treated like it's too big to fail, where the Roosevelt administration has to close all the banks in the famous bank holiday. And it's not clear that Giannini's bank was really met the standards to reopen. but they couldn't let this bank go down, and there were some phone calls placed and discussions were had, and the bank was up and running again. But so you can see early on here, they didn't call it too big to fail at that point. They didn't really have the concept, but that is in fact what was happening. That's what the regulators were doing in terms of how they treated Giannini's bank.
And I think what's fascinating that you're able to pull together, and this goes from when we think about these different intersecting stories. So to your point, the Irish immigrant who writes a letter, and the politician, someone like Carter Glass or William Jennings Bryan, these national figures, and the individual level, as well as these big bankers. And I think what's often missed is and the challenge of researching this at the level that you do. And when I was going through the book, and you see the newsletters that you identify, the different farmers groups, different union newsletters, newspapers, and it's a remarkably rich and deep archival base that you played with. And again, I just want to commend you on it, because it's not easy to find these, the quotes and the letters and the ideas that you do and are able to trace out. It's at the heart of it. This is what history is, and it's an amazing job to do it from the ground up, when we're often so used on this topic to doing it from the top down, as had been done so often in other books on this topic. And then you do all of that, and we get to the end, right? The end of banking politics. So we have this set of reforms. We have legislation that's passed. And so what causes this end of banking politics? And in your mind, why doesn't it persist into the post-war period when arguably it should have and could have? And in fact, I think what's interesting is, it's almost dissipates after decades of discussion and conversation and antagonism. And as to your point, this adversarial discussions, it seems to have just been resolved. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean that's the thing is the banking politics. It was inherently adversarial because it was essentially the bankers who had their agenda on one side and didn't want to yield, and on the other side, this grassroots movement of people who said, there's a lot of problems with the banks here. They won't give affordable loans. They have a high tendency to fail and then lead to economic depressions and on and on and on. And so they were always butting heads. And what changes, though, is that as you go through the Progressive era and into the New Deal, you get these reforms like the Federal Reserve Act, like setting up a savings bank at the post office, like setting up an agricultural credit system, like establishing the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, reforms to the Federal Reserve that allow it to start managing the economy more. And the result of this is a banking system and a monetary system that is actually much better at serving the people. So, their money, their savings is now safe. They are able to get an affordable loan. We're not having depressions every 10 or 20 years that the banking system is either the cause of or it's making worse. And so this transformation, it changes the society, it changes the economy, and it also changes the politics, where the impetus for banking politics, what motivated people here was their lived experience. Their lived experience dealing with what they thought was an exploitative and flawed banking system controlled by high-handed bankers who did not take into consideration the social impact of their business activities and what they were doing. And so what you see then is that the banking system becomes kind of more humane. It starts serving the people more because of the reforms that the banking politics movement had achieved. And so this definitely is quite apparent by the New Deal at this point, where the reforms start coming even faster, and are even kind of bigger in their ramifications. And so after World War II, you have an America that's like prosperous to a degree that the average American had never imagined that they would be, where you have working class people are becoming middle class, and they're able to open a savings account and they put their money in there and it's safe, and they can get a loan for to run a farm or for a house, and all these things, and you're not having the depression all the time. I mean, the economy is very stable. And so that lived experience is just very different at that point. So it's, in fact, the successes of banking politics that in the end undermine it, and take it out of the American political tradition. And so it's kind of almost forgotten, which is in a certain sense shocking, because it dates back to the 19th century. I mean, in some sense, maybe it dates back to Andrew Jackson's war on the bank in a certain way, but certainly it dates back to the Gilded Age and the greenbackers and the populists, and then you see it in the progressive era, and you see it in the through the New Deal. But it's just not there in the post-war era, and I think it's because you just have a very different political economy at that moment, and especially in terms of the role that finance is playing in American society by that time period. And again, that changes thanks to banking politics. So it's kind of paradoxical that it's success is in fact then what actually means the end of this movement.
Well, I think that's a great point to take on, because as we talked about, you have decades of opposition by the bankers, claiming that this will be the end of American banking itself, any kind of reform, any basic reform, including, again, some of the things we take for granted, like deposit insurance, right? And you even have quotes where they're talking about that this is the end of Western civilization, right? The end of everything as we know it. And instead, what we see is this flourishing, as you describe, a flourishing of not just the American economy post-war. Now, it's not just because of these banking reforms, but that is a key piece here of it, but also the fact that the success of it essentially takes this out of a discussion, that discussion among, as you describe it, this broad grassroots coalition. So it's this fascinating paradox that occurs. And the fact that the bankers, quite frankly, gave up their resistance and were wrong. We're just blatantly wrong in everything that they were describing. But in your discussion of the end of banking politics, and this is what I also really liked about the book, was you take it a step forward, right? So we have this to discuss the impact, then the implications of the end, by something even far more recent, which is the 2008 financial crisis, the implications of which we're still living with today, right? Some 12 years later. And you note that while Americans became increasingly distant from banking politics, they were, as you write, ensnared in various forms of indebtedness, from mortgages to student loans and credit cards, auto loans. And meanwhile, and this is a remarkable number that you give, the 6 largest banking corporations in 1995 held assets equivalent to 17% of GDP. A decade later, right, by 2006, so just on the cusp of the 2008 financial crisis, those 6 largest banks hold 55% of the equivalent of 55% of GDP in assets. And then what's even more remarkable is that after the 2008 crisis, they hold 63%. It doesn't go down, it actually increases. And so here we are, 12 years removed from the financial crisis of 2008. And we still haven't seen a reemergence of banking politics. I'm curious, why do you think that is? Because it would seem that the ground is there, right? The environment is there for such a reemergence of this discussion, and yet we really haven't seen it.
It's definitely pretty stark, when you know the history to see the present. And yeah, I mean, the economy. And, it doesn't matter if you're an economist, a political scientist, a historian, everyone talks about how we've had this financialization of the entire economy that's occurred. And so, yeah, where's the modern day banking politics? I think the answer to that is that, it takes a while for things like this to grow and build. And, and that's what we saw with the banking politics of the early 20th century, where the greenbackers, the populists. I mean, every time it's sort of getting bigger and more mainstream, and you see this process happen over time. And so the problem, I think, with people who want to have a kind of politics like that today is they're sort of starting from scratch because banking politics just was absent in the post-war era. And one interesting thing, though, that we're beginning to see is sort of the start of the new banking politics. Definitely, people are much more interested in these issues now that I finished the book than they were back when I began the dissertation, and more knowledgeable about them as well. And we've seen things pop up, like we saw Occupy Wall Street, right? And there's been movements to get state banks, public banks, in various parts of the country as well. Looking back, looking to the Bank of North Dakota, which was a legacy of early 20th century banking politics, and is the only government state bank in the country. So there's pieces of this you're starting to see, but I guess after looking at the all the research I did for the book here, you gotta come from somewhere here. You can't just make this out of whole cloth, out of scratches. That's not going to happen right away. But I do think it does look like some changes are underway and are happening. And you can even see this with the Democratic Party has endorsed some reforms they never would have 10 years ago, banking reforms, and then the Republican Party is officially, technically, against too big to fail banks. At least they were in 2016, and they have the same platform this time in 2020. So I guess they remain opposed to it too. So we could be seeing a new wave of this potentially.
One of the things I think that's really fascinating, because this is the U.S. and the World workshop. These book conversations are all books that intersect in some way with the place of the United States in the broader world. And what's so great about your book, I think, is that it begins with the U.S. banking system as very different from the rest of the world. There's no national bank. There are limited regulations or controls. And then you track this transition in your time period from that to then the U.S. becoming the foundation of the post-war international banking system, right? And in a sense, the banking reforms being applied to global finance. And so you write about the Bretton Woods Agreement, that it presented a promising harbinger to opponents of the power of finance, suggesting that private banking power was passing further under public control. But it also, as we just discussed, contributed to the end of banking politics. So what was that process? And do you think it was an intended or unintended consequence of the successive reforms?
Bretton Woods is, this major issue that's always there whenever anyone discusses like post-war U.S. and the world. Bretton Woods is right there, right? And what I would say is that a lot of the sort of groundwork in terms of the ideas for Bretton Woods is laid in the 1930s, and it's something that the New Deal endorses. And in fact, the central idea here of Bretton Woods, which is we're going to make the international financial system more stable. I mean, that was exactly what these grassroots activists involved in banking politics wanted. So Bretton Woods now is taking this on an international scale because, in terms of American financial institutions, this is decided domestically. It's decided in Washington, D.C. or in state capitals, places like that. So there's no way that these grassroots activists could have that kind of international reach. But now, thanks to Bretton Woods, these ideas that they believe in have that international impact. And I think that, again, it's sort of the same thing we're talking about in terms of how the domestic reforms took away the sort of reason for people to engage with these issues on a domestic level. And yeah, Bretton Woods, just because now we have a whole way to make international finance actually work more for ordinary citizens, just is even more so a way to sort of de-incentivize any engagement with these issues. And I do think that the people who frame Bretton Woods, they're interested in having a stable order economically and also politically, right? I mean, they don't want these kinds of mass movements out there shaking things up and stuff like that. They want to set up a system that's going to work, and you won't have this kind of turmoil going on. So I definitely think that's in their mind. And they're able to achieve this. They're able to achieve it, and it works very well for about a quarter century until Nixon closes the gold window.
So I think building on that, another key aspect, of course, of the post-war system is now the primacy of the U.S. dollar. And it strikes me, in reading your book, that I don't recall any of those reformers ever saying that this should be the case, right? That's the end goal we want, all right? And at the same time, you don't really hear the bankers saying that, even though they're part of this international system, it's still fairly parochial. In the American banking in 1910, 2030s, it's still pretty parochial, and even the national, but like the APG and ENI, are not necessarily international banks. And so I'm curious if the emergence of the U.S. dollar and the primacy of the U.S. dollar, if you saw this as an intended or an unintended consequence of banking politics.
There are definitely bankers in New York City who are interested in these issues at the really big banks. But in terms of your average banker, and there's thousands of them, right? There's thousands of banks in the United States. This is one of the things that makes the American financial system unique. This is not at the top of their concerns. They have a lot of other issues that they're worried about. And in terms of the grassroots banking politics activists, they want a dollar that isn't going to, you're not going to have big price drops if you're, an agricultural commodity producer, right? If you're a farmer, something like that. They want that kind of thing. But they're not concerned. They have much more immediate concerns, like, will my deposits be safe? Can I get a loan? Rather than looking at, these international monetary issues. So, I mean, that's the reality, and you're right, that it's really looks pretty parochial, right, compared to how it looks in the post-war era. And that's definitely a big shift. But I do think that if you hadn't have had basic reforms put in place, like a Federal Reserve System that is somewhat responsive to the American people in terms of trying to stabilize the economy, like a Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation that makes it so that the banking system is actually stable and you aren't having, banking panics and regular bank failures and things like that. It seems hard to imagine that it really would have been possible to have the Bretton Woods system with the dollar at the center if you had not had those reforms put in place beforehand. So, these kind of parochial concerns did have a larger international global impact, certainly.
So in the last chapter of your book, you offer a sweeping overview of neoliberalism and its impact both domestically and in U.S. foreign policy, both economic policy and then its relationship to, we could take it even further to talk about its relationship to U.S. foreign policy, places like Chile and Turkey, et cetera, as well as implications for global finance. But one implication you note is that the contentious politics of the previous century were largely absent as this unfolded. Particularly, you referenced Nixon earlier, so if we take it from Nixon to 2008. And so you conclude that the absence of vigorous public protest is, quote, an anomaly in the grand sweep of American history. So we have seen, and as you mentioned a couple of these, so Occupy Wall Street and the summer of Black Lives Matter, we have seen these spasms of large protests. But we haven't seen a firm political program emerge. And I'm curious if you think how similar that is to the trends you discussed from the last century, that transition from the late 19th into the early 20th, and if perhaps what we could be seeing is in this early 21st into the rest of the century, if we could be seeing a similar kind of trend. And is this just limited to the U.S., or what do we think about the rest of the world when we look at some of the protests around, for instance, post-2008, in response to austerity measures, et cetera, or at least in Western Europe? How similar is this lack of public engagement, or at least public protest, around these financial issues? And how is it similar to the period you're discussing?
My impression is that the amount of popular engagement with financial issues in the United States is something of an anomaly, and that has to do with the fact that the American financial system has been something of an anomaly. But I do think after 2008, I mean, you clearly saw in, say, Western Europe, a lot of attention now being paid and a lot more popular interest in these banking issues. And so that's definitely an interesting development that we have going on at the moment. And in terms of sort of the lack of a program here that we're seeing in, we are seeing these popular kind of upswellings around various issues going on, but yeah, they're not necessarily particularly programmatic in their approach. I think that if you look, there's in part it's because in terms of banking, this is because there isn't that sort of intellectual legacy to draw on, and that makes it more difficult. But I do think that a parallel is that in the early 20th century, you have this coalition, and they're kind of all over the place in a certain sense, right? I mean, there's farmers, there's union members, there's progressive reformers, there's all these different individuals and groups, and they don't all want the same thing. They're not all in message. They're not all pushing their reforms together in harmony. And so there's a certain strength to that. Kind of makes it able to be a little more flexible and move here and more there. But yeah, there also is this lack of a unified voice. They certainly are opposed to what the bankers' agenda is, but they're not all coming together and rallying around the same points. So I do think that there is a parallel there between kind of the way we're seeing this popular politics operate in the early 21st century and the way that banking politics operated in the early 20th century.
Great. I mean, I think maybe, and if you disagree, that it'd be great to hear your take on it. I think maybe the closest that we've probably come to, there was some opposition to too big to fail, and it was pretty scattered, and in the sense that shouldn't the bailout have been directed instead of at the banks, at homeowners? So but again, this was pretty anecdotal. It was not. It was in no way was it a consistent outcry, and in many cases, it was often discussed, after the fact, and there were some discussions during the time, but pretty scattered. And I'm thinking over the past year or two of the presidential election season, what we've seen is discussions about student loans, right? Eliminating student loan debt, and some bits of antagonism. I think what's interesting is when I think about some of the debates about student loan debt, it also reminded me of your book in the sense that there was less of an informed discussion in the media and more of a focus on outrage from the individual parent who's saved for their child, right? And what happens to them? Why should they be penalized was often the way it was discussed. So it also seems to me that even in this age of mass communication and social media, that we're seeing in a way less information about financial issues than we should be getting, and instead what we actually have is still kind of this fixation on the scorecard of the Dow Jones, the Nasdaq. And I'm curious, I'm wondering if you agree with that, or if you think that's not necessarily related.
No, I mean, I totally agree that in terms of economic reporting and the way that the economy is incorporated into current events, it's way too focused on the stock market, right? And way too focused also, I think, just on the business side of the equation too. I mean, yeah, where's labor? And then when it comes to these financial questions, there's just this default like, well, the stock market's going up, so seems like everything must actually be kind of okay after all. And that is not really, it just doesn't reflect on the ground what's going on in people's lives at all. I mean, there's a disjunct between what the stock market's doing and what the real economy is doing, right? People say between Wall Street and Main Street. Well, there's also this disjuncture, frankly, between what's reported and what's actually happening and is going unreported.
I think what's fascinating, this is where your book is so important in many ways, because it's the antidote, if you will, to a number of his books that came out around 2008, including Too Big to Fail, which fixated so much again on elites, right? The Henry Paulsons, Secretary of the Treasurer, the Bernankes, and so little about and the heroic efforts they went to save the economy, and so little about the policies that got the United States and got the financial system into that place to begin with, and including from the 90s to that point, almost all of that. We don't want to get into how this happened. We're going to talk about how they attempted to quote unquote save it and the heroic efforts they went to. And of course, the path not taken is often never discussed. To your point, when we look at in the book the amount of GDP that's then held in terms of the percent of GDP in assets that's held by the largest banks. And so, when I think about, and again, how much of that story you're going against with your book from the turn of the last century, and we're still seeing it, that continued fixation on the elites when it comes to banking and financial issues. It's pretty remarkable and pretty consistent, I think. And again, some of this, you hear this in discussions, including, when we talk about Bretton Woods, which you mentioned earlier, and when Bretton Woods is written about, one of my favorite comments is that, here was this really invasive agreement, right, in the lives of everyday Americans, and yet, it's not clear that when it passed through Congress, that any member of Congress had actually read the legislation, had actually looked at what the implications of this were, and probably didn't even understand it. I mean, and that's how much of that do you think is also? That's what's fascinating to me about your book, is when you're looking at these letters of, from individual immigrants, and just how well they understood the system and the problems, and how much of that's been stripped away from kind of our writing and our discussion about financial issues today. And I'm curious why you think that is. Is it about, again, we're back to this scorecard and just how little time is devoted to discussion of financial issues, even when you think about whether it's the evening news or newspapers, et cetera, and it's almost always fixated on the big deals, the big money, big money deals and big money information, very little on the actual nuts and bolts.
Definitely, the people I'm looking at have just a better grasp on these issues than we see, and many times a day, just like you were saying. And what I can say is, back then they were reading the newspaper, right? I mean, they were consuming this mainstream media sources, and in a lot of ways, I think that those sources provided better coverage than they do today, frankly. But they also had their own independent media outlets too. Unions were publishing their journals. Farm organizations were doing the same. And you also had these people that are talking about it amongst themselves. And, they are members of civic organizations. And that's kind of a key point here, is that these people are already organized. They're organized in the labor unions. They're organized in the farm organizations. And in their meetings, they're talking about these issues. This is also the time when you had, in major cities, certainly, public parks where people were out there giving speeches, and they were talking about the money question. And you could stop and listen if you wanted to, right? And this would happen in small towns too, where someone sets up a soapbox on the corner and they start talking about this. This is the reality, is that there is this kind of public sphere where these discourses and discussions this discourse is happening at that time. And, obviously we have all these ways we can communicate with each other at this point in time, but I don't know that it was conducive to getting as in-depth and having people in the end be as well informed about these issues and then translating that into action. So I think that is a difference between these two time periods.
I think it's a great point when you think about, you can imagine somebody setting up a soapbox today and talking about financial issues, right, in Times Square. But we have, in a way that they never had then, even though they had the newsletters, which I think, again, this important resource for your book, Reddit, when you think about Facebook, when you think about blogs, Medium, areas where you can have these discussions, and you could actually start to galvanize you would think more discussion around these issues. So I want to transition because I think it's really an important part of this book, but because you've written about it elsewhere, and again, it's very timely right now, which is the role of the post office. When we talk about these connections, how do people stay connected? In the time period you're discussing, and where we are now, you've written a previous book about the post office, and the post office has an important role in this book. And so I'm curious, why was the post office seen by immigrants and the working poor as such a reputable and stable institution compared to the banks? Because it's a consistent part of the book. Over and over again, you see that it's immigrants and the working poor who over and over again want the post office to have a larger role in their everyday lives, and particularly in banking.
The post office is really seen as a model for what government enterprise can do. And I mean, this is something that the populists are talking about, and then it's definitely right at the middle of every single financial debate in the early 20th century, right? Well, oh, I want, a bank that will be stable. Well, how about the post office? Oh, well, I want a bank where I can go get a loan. Well, why doesn't the post office start giving loans, right? And I mean, definitely the prestige of the post office was very high, and it really was, again, seen as a model of the way that government can play a positive role in people's lives. And so I think this, again, is just drawing on the lived experience of people. And there wasn't a postal savings system in this country until 1910, the law is passed, and then it gets up and running after that. And at that point, the U.S. is again an anomaly, because in basically the rest of what would then have been the industrialized world, you had these banks in almost every nation. So this meant that then for immigrants from the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungary Hungary Empire, the Greece, Italy, Sweden, they're coming to America and they have an experience with these banks, and they're wondering why don't we have this here in the United States? So there's that out there too. But certainly the post office was well respected and highly regarded at the time. And it pops up again and again as a model, and people wanted to do more than it's doing. It's already, it's delivering our mail. Yes, we can get a money order there, but really it should get into banking in a major way. And that was the demand repeatedly.
And I think that's another interesting aspect about the book, when we come back to this idea about the U.S. and the world, was that the immigrants brought this experience with them, and then expected it here, right? And when it wasn't
Right.
here, and instead what they saw, which I think is this great part of your book, are these crooked bankers. The number of bank failures and the amount of graft and crime that goes on, and it's the bankers at the center of it. That they're not held in the same esteem. And I'm trying to think of what some of the characters in your book would have thought of, people like Henry Paulson and the investment bankers by 2008, how that, to them, I think it wouldn't have been a surprise that a system had been created that was bound to fail. All right. Or the fact that, coming out of the experience of a JP Morgan or the Mellon family, that, some of the leading investment bankers are now, monitoring the chiefs in charge of the financial system, right? I mean, it's kind of that's one of these trends that goes through, and you can see it. You can see them warning against it. You can see their anger about the Federal Reserve System. To your point about William Jennings Bryan, so I think it's a great point about the Postal Service and this desire, because they're interacting with it on a daily basis, and they're also interacting on a daily basis with the exact opposite, which are the banks, right? And seeing that as just this negative. And so, of course, even though the Postal Savings System is effective, it's used, this is another paradox in a way, that the banking reforms of the 30s that you described and the end of banking politics actually have an impact on the Postal Savings System. And so how did that come about, the actual demise of the Postal Savings System? And is there a place for it today? Again, I'm wondering if you think that's something that could be or should be revived.
You made a good point about the fact that the bankers were really often involved in white collar crime. So a lot of the time when people talk about, well, why are bank failures happening, or the way that the wave of bank failures definitely exacerbated the Great Depression in the 1930s, it's, all about kind of the macro economic scale, what's going on there. And then people, when you start looking at these individual banks, what you see is a lot of practices that shouldn't have been happening that are going on. And so as a response to that, there's this huge rush in the postal savings where it's, the amount of deposits increases by many-fold in a very short period of time. And so it seems like, hey, postal savings might really become something more here. I mean, and there were people who were pushing very hard for that to happen. But what you see, this is a case where one of the reforms of the banking politics wants kind of undercuts the other one, which is, okay, the FDIC gets put in place. Well, now we know the bank is safe, right? So that then takes away sort of the biggest competitive advantage the postal savings had, which is that the government stands behind the post office. When you put your savings in there, you're able to get it back out. So that's one way in which the New Deal undercuts postal savings. And another way is that one of the demands that's heard repeatedly is, let's take that money deposited at the post office and let's start lending it to ordinary citizens. But then the New Deal comes up with, special credit programs for farmers and for homeowners and just for average Americans. And so this really means that now you're able to get these kind of loans you've been wanting. And so the calls for the post office to do this, they start to diminish and fall away. So that's sort of the way that the post office is kind of removed from the political discussion around finance. But it's still there. It has, billions dollars in deposit. It has like 1 million depositors up until right before the very end, which is in 1966, and then it's officially wound down in 1967. But throughout its existence, which is over half a century, the bankers are lobbying to get rid of this. They're lobbying against it and lobbying against it, but they can't get anywhere because there's so much popular support. But then again, in the post-war moment, this kind of changes, and by the 1950s, by the 1960s, the popular interest has waned, and the people who are still using it are now often people who are even less articulate, less organized, they're less able to have their voices heard. And so, the 1960s is an opportune moment for the bankers to finally lobby Congress to get rid of it. And, their claim is that this is now unnecessary, it's outdated, we don't need it anymore. And in the 1960s, right, kind of like 1965, 1964, like the sort of, in some ways, the height of the post-war moment economically, that kind of made sense, right? But what they forget is, things change. And so by the end of the 20th century, you're seeing a lot of people are locked out of the banking system. They're using these fringe banking providers, pawn shops, check cashers, payday loans, all these kinds of operations. And that's still the case today, where you have a lot of people who just can't really access the financial system. So those claims that the postal savings system would never be needed again, back in the 50s and 60s, just didn't turn out to be true. And yeah, I definitely think there's clearly a large market that the private banking system is not interested in serving. And so, in our system, when that doesn't happen, when the private business doesn't step up, the government will step in. And it seems to me like this is an obvious case where that should happen. And there's more and more of a trend to it becoming possible to happen. So, we'll see what happens here.
And I think that's a great point. It takes us back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier about some of this dissipation of banking politics. And when you think about what you describe in the book, where farmers have difficulty getting loans or decent terms on loans, right? And you have, union workers looking for and kind of locked out of banking, immigrants who are locked out of banking or don't trust the bankers. And so the unions start setting up their own banks, or then you get the Postal Savings System. And so I think what may be missing, and this takes us back to it also, when you think about the role of the post office in a community, as it would have been in the turn of the last century, or these community issues. I mean, this may be the connection as to why this idea of eliminating student debt did pick up such a vibrant force among a number of Americans, because so many have it. It's something that they share. right? It's this common issue that numbers share, especially among immigrant and minority groups. The idea of, check cashing, money loan places where you can pay, your money grant to pay a bill, or send money overseas to a family member. These are issues where those communities can't get service from the big banks, often, use kind of these unreliable vendors or vendors who charge these outrageous sums. You can see why, again, the post office, which, is accessible or should be, would be something they would be interested in using the postal savings system if it was available to them again. But this lack of kind of a common thread, and that, to your point, that taking us back to the grassroots coalition, because so many elements of that coalition were experiencing similar issues. So whether it was lack of access to credit, it was foreclosures on farms, it was the issue of among union workers and lack of access to banks or trustworthy banks. Perhaps that's the issue, why banking politics has not reemerged in such a vibrant way, and that we're lacking a consistent issue across a number of different groups, that they see it as a broader financial, as a systemic financial issue. And I'm curious if you think that's part of it, or if you think it's even more broad than that.
I think that, you're right that, the student loan issue, for instance, well, there's a lot of students in America, right? And it's something they're all dealing with, so something they can all rally behind. But then, yeah, if you're somebody who, the way that you translate your paycheck into cash is you go down to the liquor store, right? You're probably not paying student loan debt,
Right.
So there definitely is this fracturing around the issue. I would say that during the early 20th century, that was there too, and what happened is they kind of found ways to overcome that and surmount that. But again, I think this had a lot to do with the fact that they were organized, right? And people just, it's kind of like Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, right? That kind of civic organization is not there in the same way here in the early 21st century. So yeah, I see your point, and definitely think that it fits into this broader picture.
So you mentioned this a little bit, and I'm wondering, because we're going through a manufactured crisis today regarding the Postal Service, that there were a number of debates, and there was a lot of antagonism towards the Postal Savings System in the first part of the 20th century, and then culminating in 65, where, even though it's successful, when the numbers that you provide in the book, and in your first book, about how widely used it was, right? And even when it's shut down, to have 1 million depositors, right, and billions of dollars in assets, is remarkable. It's remarkable that it's not talked about more. This was a successful institution that was effectively killed. And so I'm wondering, what lessons can we derive from the manufactured crisis today about the post office and the debates about the postal savings system, 50 to 70 years ago, if not 100 years ago?
Well, I think it's similar in terms of the fact that, yeah, the argument that was made against postal savings in the 1960s was this is out of date. This is from the horse and buggy era, essentially. And what do you hear about the post office today? What is it, the U.S. Postal Service? It's from the horse and buggy era. And what I would say is that that's probably true. If for some people, it probably isn't particularly central to their lives. But this forgets millions of people who live in rural areas where, there's some broadband internet access, who are older and just are not online. And part of that, who are lower income and can't even afford a computer, not to mention, bill to an internet service provider. So there's millions of people for whom this horse and buggy argument does not apply. And then also, why is the Postal Service in the news again? Because we have an election in 2020 and we have a pandemic, right? And no one saw that one coming. Well, aren't we glad that there's this network in place that could actually allow us to vote? We have a lot of issues here with the Postmaster General, who's doing things that, look like they're not designed to make this election work smoothly, certainly. But isn't it good that it's there? And so I think that it was presumptuous in 1965 for people to decide the postal savings system was out of date or never be used again. And I think it's pretty presumptuous in 2020 for people to point to an institution that's existed since 1775 right? Second Continental Congress appoints Ben Franklin, so it's older than the nation itself, to say suddenly, well, this actually doesn't have a place in our world anymore. So, one thing you study history, hopefully you become a little less arrogant around these kinds of issues, because no one as recently as January or February probably would have even seen how the Postal Service would be so important in 2020. And we have no idea what else could come down the pike here and why else we might need the Postal Service in the future. So I think we should definitely count 10 and before we make any radical changes in the Postal Service, and also look more broadly at its impact on American society.
Well, and to your point, the Postal Service had actually a plan that was blocked to send out masks to every American, right? And so, the reality is that there are elements in place that they've had in place because the Postal Service, the Postal Service has been this longstanding institution, and they have a number of emergency measures in place to help Americans should there be any kind of natural disaster, any kind of issue. And it is remarkable that what we're seeing, to your point, is a revisiting of these ideas that, well, these things are outdated, these things are no longer needed, and yet we see on a daily basis that they are needed, and we know they're needed. Dr. Chris Shaw, I want to thank you for taking the time. I want to hold up your oath here: Money, Power, and the People. It is a great book, and I want to thank you for writing it. I want to thank you for all your hard work in researching and writing the books. I think it's such an important work.
Well, thank you for having me on, and yeah, I've definitely enjoyed discussing Money, Power, and the People with you.